Well, thank you for that very nice introduction. It's great to be here at the Harvest Conference, talking to the Harvest Consortium. I do believe this is one of the absolute most exciting things that NASA does, which is take what we do, the discoveries that we make, the technologies that we innovate, and then applying it in a way that improves the human condition, not just for the United States of America, but in fact for the entire world. That's what NASA's legacy is, it's what our history is, and it's what we're continuing to do today. She mentioned that I was an alpaca farmer. That is true. For a period of time, I lived in a town called Fernley, Nevada, outside of Reno. I was flying with the Naval Strike and Air Warfare Center, which is the parent command to Top Gun. My job was to fly Red Air in an F-18 Hornet. In other words, I was the bad guy. I was a Navy pilot. And when I was doing that, I had the opportunity to purchase a little ranch and buy some farm animals, and I absolutely loved it. But here's the thing. Fernley, Nevada is in the high desert of Nevada. It's very arid. And of course, if you want to have a field of grass to feed your alpacas, you've got to be able to irrigate. Well, how did we irrigate? We irrigated from the Truckee-Carson Irrigation District, which of course got its water from the Sierra Nevada mountains. And when we think about the missions that NASA does, specifically one of them is the Airborne Snow Observatory, which is, the question is, how do we measure how much snow is in the Sierra Nevada mountains and convert that snowpack into a water equivalent so we know ultimately how much water there will be to irrigate. And of course, this is one of the areas that NASA is working on all the time and improving our forecasts greatly. And of course, the way we do the Airborne Snow Observatory, we use LIDAR, laser detection and ranging. And when we think about LIDAR, why does NASA use LIDAR? Well, we use it because we wanted to map the moon. We wanted to be able to map, in fact, Mars. And now what we can do is we can use it to map the Earth. And we do it from an airborne snow observatory, in other words, an airplane. Of course, we also use it from space when you think of ICESat and those kind of missions as well. But ultimately, we're measuring how much snow is in the Sierra Nevada mountains. We're using LIDAR to measure the height of the mountains when there is no snow, and then we measure the height of the mountains when there is snow. We figure out down to a square meter how much snowpack there is throughout the Sierra Nevada mountains, and then we convert that into a water equivalent, all using LIDAR technology, which of course has been advanced by NASA. Then what we do is we take not just the LIDAR and figure out what the snowpack is, but then we figure out how fast is the snow going to melt based on the color. So we use spectroscopy, another capability that NASA has advanced and continues to advance for a whole host of reasons that have nothing to do necessarily with water or irrigation or snowpack, but ultimately apply it in a way that enables us to separate the colors of the reflected light from the snow and figure out ultimately how fast is this snow going to melt and when is it going to materialize in a way that we can use to irrigate our land. So these are things that I know this consortium is very interested in. Of course, I've had the opportunity to live it out 15 years ago or whenever it was. NASA wasn't doing nearly as much as it is today in this area. But because of what NASA is doing, the technologies we have advanced, we're going to get really good. In fact, we are really good already at not just predicting how much water there will be to irrigate, but when that water will materialize and where it will materialize, so ultimately water resource managers can make great decisions, or at least the least painful decisions. And I can tell you, in the high desert of Nevada, there are painful decisions. We've got endangered species that we have to look out for. Of course, we have irrigation that we need to do for our crops. We also have things like fires that we have to be prepared for. We need reservoirs to be full, but we also need reservoirs to be empty at the same time in case there's a flood and these kind of activities. So this kind of activity, where we are very precisely measuring snow from an airborne snow observatory is of course going to be transformational for water resource managers, also for the people that are responsible for helping us provide water for populations to drink. The Sierra Nevada mountains, of course, provide water supplies for San Francisco Bay and Los Angeles, massive population centers, which of course are also competing for those resources. So it's great to be here at the Harvest Consortium. It's great to be here at this conference. I do believe that when you think about all of the things that NASA does, this could very well be one of the most important things that NASA does, which is provide food security. How ultimately do we feed more of the world than ever before and mitigate the ebbs and flows that come from food insecurity? And ultimately that's what this consortium is all about. I want to talk for a second about evapotranspiration and some of the missions that I know people in this room are very involved in. So when you go to the desert of California, for example, we have ground sensors. Every 1.25 square miles there is a ground sensor in certain parts of the desert of California where we're very accurately measuring evapotranspiration. But what it comes down to is 1.25 square miles isn't good enough for a lot of farmers because evapotranspiration is different down to, quite frankly, 1/4 of an acre, let alone a 1.25 square miles. So when we take the measurements that we get from these ground sensors and we're able to combine it with MODIS data from Terra and Aqua and ultimately Landsat, which I know was mentioned just a few minutes ago, and take what NASA is doing, combine it with what USGS is doing, and do partnerships. For example, with the University of California Cooperative Extension, and get very accurate evapotranspiration measurements down to 1/4 of a square acre, down to 1/4 of an acre, I should say. Ultimately, what we're enabling people to do is increase crop yields while reducing water usage and preserving nitrates in the soil. All of that is critically important, and it's all happening because of technologies advanced and utilized by NASA, not necessarily for this purpose, but ultimately finding an application for it that is going to be transformational for the food supply. And when we think about Terra and Aqua and Landsat and using those technologies to combine with the evapotranspiration numbers that are being driven terrestrial from ground sensors, and then ultimately taking all of this data and being able to put it on somebody's cell phone so that a farmer somewhere in rural California can go to his spot on his farm and get a very accurate evapotranspiration number and apply it to his soil type and his crop and create a very specific irrigation plan and ultimately increase crop yields while, and we've demonstrated this already, while reducing water use by as much as 25%. That's amazingly significant. Reducing water use by 25% while increasing crop yields. And at the same time preserving the nitrates in the soil, which is why those crop yields go up to begin with. Those nitrates are critical for the crops, and by the way, when they enter the water supply, it costs a lot of money for water managers to clean the nitrates out of the water supply when it comes to drinking water. We're talking about millions and millions of dollars. So NASA is actually saving lots of money for the American taxpayer while at the same time increasing crop yields, reducing water usage, protecting endangered species as a matter of fact, because we know how much water we need to irrigate and those kind of things. I also want to mention something else that I think is important. She mentioned, yes, we're going to the moon, we're going to go sustainably to the moon, and then we're going to go on to Mars. And of course, as the NASA administrator, this consumes a lot of my time. It is also true that we're able to do these things because of activities that we've learned on the International Space Station. And I want to talk for a second about how valuable the International Space Station is, not just to where we are today, but where we're going in the future. We are able to put experiments on the International, think of it as a big satellite, and we can put all kinds of hosted payloads on a big satellite. And eco-stress is one of those examples. Now I understand eco-stress is in its infancy. But the idea that you can measure the temperature of a plant from space in infrared and ultimately determine the stress of that plant is potentially transformational. And the idea that we can do that experiment on the International Space Station to prove it out, to eventually maybe utilize it for free flyers, is something that I think is important for us to understand. The International Space Station is not just about human spaceflight. It's not just about going to the moon. it's not just about going to Mars. It's actually being used as a technology demonstration capability to reduce our costs, to improve ultimately the technological maturity of systems that will in fact improve crop yields. And so eco-stress is one of those examples where we can measure from space in infrared the stress of a plant. And of course people in this room understand that when a plant becomes stressed because it doesn't have the irrigation it needs, the stomata close. And when the stomata close, it doesn't transpire. When it doesn't transpire, the temperature of the plant goes up. And we can detect that from space now, weeks ahead of when you can detect that with the human eye. So I think all of this kind of capability is transformational, and it shows how NASA in its entirety can benefit not just Earth science, but also our space exploration all at the same time, and the International Space Station is a great example of that. The last thing I want to mention is the importance of another mission, I think, that is fascinating in my view, which is GRACE. The idea that we can measure the gravity of the Earth and how it's changing. And of course the gravity of the Earth is not uniform. And not only is it not uniform, but it's changing all the time. And measuring from space the gravity of the Earth, and then transforming that information into understanding where the water is. And I'm talking about water all the way down to 10 meters below the surface of the Earth. We're talking about the water in the soil. And being able to very accurately measure water resources, not just in the soil, but also in aquifers, and as it moves around the world with ice sheets and ice melt and everything else. I do believe that GRACE is going to be transformational as well. It's already being used for the National Drought Mitigation Center in Nebraska to help us predict when and where drought will materialize, when it will start, when it will end, and ultimately help us apply resources where we know drought will be. And of course, we've seen the benefits from not just GRACE, but our other instruments that are orbiting the Earth. I want to read a quote here. So when we talk about understanding drought, this is a quote from Martin Awar, Commissioner of the Office of the Prime Minister in Uganda, and he used our data to address drought in his country before it even happened. And this is what he said. In the past, we always reacted to crop failure, spending billions of shillings to provide food aid in the region. 2017 was the first time we acted proactively because we had clear evidence from satellite data very early in the season. Friends, that's what it's all about. Instead of spending tens of millions of dollars retroactively, we could spend a couple of millions of dollars proactively and prevent the disaster that otherwise would have occurred. That's what this consortium is all about. That's what the Harvest Consortium is all about. And because of the activities of the people in this room, lives are going to be improved, lives will be transformed. Disasters that otherwise would have happened will not happen. So I really believe when we think about the exciting things that NASA is doing, yes, we're going to the moon. We're thrilled about the fact that we now have this very diverse, highly qualified astronaut corps that is going to enable us for the first time since 1972 go to the moon, this time with women for the first time. It's never happened before. And go to, did I hear a cheer down here? All right. But it is also true that as exciting as that is, and the idea that we're going to Mars and making these discoveries, I'm sure many in this room saw that we had this massive discovery of large amounts of methane on Mars that, of course, increases the probability. I'm not saying we're going to find life, but it greatly increases the probability that life may have or maybe even does exist on Mars. And of course, the idea that there's water on Mars, liquid water, which is a discovery made in the last year. Maybe we need to send a GRACE mission to Mars. I don't know. But the idea that there's liquid water on Mars, there's a methane cycle on Mars that's commensurate with the seasons of Mars. All of these activities are very exciting. That's why we're going to Mars. It's why we're using the moon to get to Mars. But ultimately, what are we most proud about as an agency at NASA? We have elevated the human condition, transformed the human condition. the way we communicate. DirecTV, Dish Network, Internet broadband. Some people are watching this right now live on the Internet. If you're from rural Oklahoma, you might be watching this using Internet broadband from space right now, which is the only way you could potentially get Internet broadband in rural parts of not just this country, but all over the world. But the way we communicate, the way we navigate, GPS, the way we produce food, the way we produce energy, the way we do national security and disaster relief, understand weather, predict how the climate is changing. All of these things are technologies that are developed by this little agency that gets less than 0.5% of the federal budget. And ultimately, it has elevated the human condition in ways that if you go back to the 1960s during the Apollo era, nobody could have possibly imagined. And here we are, 50 years after Apollo, talking to a conference of people involved in agriculture, scientists and technologists that are involved in the ag industry, and we're talking about increasing crop yields while reducing water usage and preserving nitrates in the soil. Who would have thought that? And the idea that we are continuing to use all of NASA's technologies to improve the human condition for all time. It's very exciting. So I just want to say thank you for having me here at the Harvest Conference. Thank you for being part of the Harvest Consortium. Know this, we know how important what you do is, and we are greatly anticipating so many achievements from this organization and this group.